Hello, hello. Thanks for coming to this, the third lecture in the semester's lecture series. It's a real pleasure to welcome Sylvia Lavin to the Kent State College of Architecture and Environmental Design. Sylvia has already met with our students and faculty in multiple settings. We were up at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland this morning, meeting with the grad students. And she just had a great conversation over coffee with a number of our students just before this lecture. So thanks, Sylvia, for generously sharing your time and thoughts. Sylvia Lavin, as you know, is a leading voice in current debates surrounding architectural design, history, theory, and criticism. Her research focuses on a number of different kind of urgent themes. Those include architecture's various relationships with projected media, psychoanalysis, contemporaneity, post-criticality, and so on and so forth. She is a prolific author and curator. You know her books. Her books include Quatrième de Conseil and The Invention of a Modern Language of Architecture. Form follows Libido, Architecture and Richard Neutra in a Psychoanalytic Culture. Crib Sheets, Notes on the Contemporary Architectural Conversation, Kissing Architecture, Flash in the Pan, among others. She has also curated a number of landmark exhibitions. A few years ago, her Everything Loose Will Land exhibition at the Mack Center at the Schindler House in Los Angeles was, I would argue, the most accomplished contribution to the Pacific Standard Time series of events that ran in the 2011-12 year in LA. She also curated a couple recent landmark exhibitions that have had to do with the reframing of postmodernism in architecture. One at the Chicago Architecture Biennial and the other at the Canadian Center for Architecture in Montreal. So Sylvia is clearly a prolific and widely respected critic, curator, scholar, and so on, but I would argue her most influential contributions so far come as an educator. She taught for years, more than 25 years at UCLA before recently moving to Princeton University, where she's a professor in the School of Architecture and on the executive board of the program in Media and Modernity. At UCLA, in fact, she chaired the Department of Architecture and Urban Design from 1996 to 2006. And during that decade, it was just an incredible thing that was happening at UCLA. We've had several lecturers come through here over the last few years, and I often introduce them as emerging from the golden era at UCLA. Well, Sylvia was actually the person most responsible for establishing that culture of excellence at UCLA in the golden era. There she hired an incredible roster of junior faculty. She chaired the Critical Studies in Architectural Culture MA PhD program. She installed a research studio model that has been duplicated, replicated, imitated all across the world. Some of those faculty who were teaching in the studio include Tom Main, Greg Lynn, Dagmar Richter, Bob Sommel, Neil Denari, among many others. She also, I would say most importantly, she established a culture of digital experimentation and fabrication that has actually helped to shift recent conversations from the digital to the post-digital in architectural culture. In fact, if you're writing a history of architectural education, you would not be able to exclude Sylvia from a select group of I would say paradigm-shifting educators, the likes of Harwell Harris at UT Austin, Ray Cappy at SCI-Arc, John Hayduck at the Cooper Union, Alvin Boyarsky at the Architectural Association in London, and Bernard Schumi at Columbia University. So it's a real treat to have her here sharing her new research, as I understand it, early stages of new research with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Sylvia Lavin.
That was like way impressive. I must be amazing. Actually, none of it's true, but thank you very much. I really I appreciate that. It's very nice to come and see all students and be here and share the day with you. So I suppose I kind of need to apologize in advance, particularly after that introduction, which is, I hope that you will forgive me for this lecture, which is a little bit like thinking out loud. I'm just beginning to start on a new project, and I kind of don't know what I'm doing yet and don't really know where it's going, but I'm bored with the old one, so I just thought I would tell you what's on my mind these days. And you know, I'm sure, like many of you, I was struck the other day by the Youth for Climate Action global event. And I thought, okay, well, you're youth. You're not just youth, but you're youth at Kent State University that has a long and august and honorable tradition of action. So I thought, how do we think about action today? What's worth taking action for? And are there any advantages and disadvantages to thinking about this as a problem of youth culture? Like, is it your job, or is it a new phenomenon, or how do we think about this historically? So thinking about how to think architecture in relation to the kinds of actions that are now necessary, and to think about it from within architecture, not from outside architecture, is really the problem that I have chosen to sort of struggle with. So my first thought in trying to think about this was, of course, thinking about climate and the environment is not a new problem in architecture, but it's an old problem. It has various histories. So we could just take a very short history, a recent history, and think about something like the Neutra VDL house that was built in the 1930s. It's a super well known house, but this house, just one house, has an extremely complicated history. So when Neutra built the house, he said about it, and I quote, "I planted the house here to demonstrate that you could live humanely in a small space." It's interesting to think that he decided to describe this house as having been planted there. And he speculated more broadly. This is a little bit his narcissism. Neutra was a very, very famous narcissist. He said that he really had no idea, he was mystified, why it hadn't grown over all of Los Angeles. So this is what Silver Lake looked like when he planted his house there. Kind of an extraordinary environment into which to insert something as alien as an international style house. But by the time the house was built and then the war happens and so forth, obviously Silver Lake no longer looked like this, but was fully suburbanized with, in fact, endless numbers of houses all over it. So when, in 1954, Richard Neutra then published Survival by Design, the environment that he was describing was already very different. And what he said then was, and again I quote, "Our man-made environment has shown an ominous tendency to slip more and more out of control, to become hostile to the human organism on which it perpetually acts and reacts. The environment has demonic power over us." So in 1960, it's as though in 1954 he was sort of anticipating the future because in the early 1960s his very house burned down caused by an electrical fire in a dry, arid climate with a house that was largely constructed in wood. So his house that had been planted in the 1930s became a tinderbox of plant material in the 1960s. And he began quickly then to think about how to turn the wood balloon frame into a steel structure. And it was in response to the idea that international style modernism was a steel structure that Moholy-Nagy, when reviewing a survival through design, this is what he had to say about Neutra's work in particular. In order to build the best possible polar bear cage, one has to become tremendously interested in polar bears. So this metal structure was now a cave meant to protect and house humans from, and others, I suppose, from the increasingly hostile universe. The zoo metaphor is not by accident. You probably know that Neutra modeled his furniture on animals. This one was famously the camel house because you could bend the legs up and down. So everything was a kind of robotic human, like a polar bear, living in this cage. So this is the 1960s, the beginnings of the awareness of some kind of environmental problem. The response, Neutra's response is, how do we protect humans from the devastation of the environment, right? There's really no thought about anything other than the survival of humans. Now there's a new problem that has beset the Neutra house, which is that the Neutras don't own it anymore, and the house is having its own trouble surviving. So, like many pieces of architecture, the way to survive is to no longer be a house in which something lives, but rather to become a site of cultural production. So the Neutra house is no longer a home, but is a place that artists can borrow and have residencies and to make art in it, to make sort of commodities in it, if you will. And what you're looking at now is one such recent work by a young artist named Ben Thorpe Brown. This is a very complex work that opened in Paris earlier this year. This is one section of it, but it's very interesting that the humans that once lived in this house have been replaced by a new species. So the house, there's a kind of fantastic film, and you follow the tortoise around as it struggles with stairs, and as it reads survival by design. And of course, it's not by accident that turtles are architects, right? They build their own houses, they fit well in their houses, they carry them around on their backs, and apparently live perfectly happily without really worrying much about a human survival. So if, as has often been argued, that one of the things that triggered the birth of modernity was the realization that there might have been a history before humans, we might now think that the end of modernity might have something to do with beginning to imagine what it might look like for there to be history after humans. So this is what I'm thinking about in relation to architecture and what role, what kinds of actions might I as a historian and you as architects play in this. So I suppose the bottom line here has something to do with the apartness, the especial apartness from the world that humans imagine themselves as having, right? There's the world, and then there's the humans that live in the world, and against all other things, it's humans that have to be protected. And of course, architecture, the traditional definition of architecture is a shelter for humans, by the way, right? We tend to forget that it's very humanist in its orientation, and that it's apart, right? And so that when Antonio da Sangallo is often considered the first modern architect, modern in the sense that he was a professional architect. He was not a painter, he was not a sculptor. All he did was be an architect. And when he was an architect, he systematized plans, section, elevation, the kinds of apparatus of the modern profession. So we might normally think that modern architecture begins with an image like this, where the natural world is literally erased, moved over, put apart in order to make room for architecture. Now, this apartness, architecture kind of comes in the world, and it's not fully apart. If you look at the drawing carefully, something like nature is still there. It's just pushed to the background, right? It's pushed back there, and in what becomes a very standard way, this background to architecture generally is described as being composed of atmospheric perspective. And while in painting, I don't want to go into this painting, it's usually done in terms of color. In architecture, to be reductive, atmospheric perspective is generally constructed out of three principal elements: mountains, clouds, and trees. And they're in this picture, they're in this picture. I mean, you can track almost every perspectival view of a building in a natural setting, and you have some combination of these things. And if you start to look at the representation of these elements, they tell a certain history of apartness in the human relationship to nature. So if we start with clouds, this is a mock presentation of Brunelleschi's invention of perspective, which is important to the invention of drawing. And you probably know famously that this apparatus, this performance that he did in front of the Duomo in Florence had this mirror on it to capture the passing of the cloud, and the passing of the cloud was the thing that made the image real and sort of symbolically the work of the divine. This is what Brunelleschi said. So the becoming symbolic, isolated from the rest of the world, right? So that the mirror, you see it in the thing over here on the right of the image, the clouds become removed, let's say, from the rest of the environment. They become clouds. They become isolated. They get pulled apart. Once they are apart, they get subject to scientific observation. So Leonardo starts crazily studying clouds, and then ultimately, slowly, they become the object of technological production, right? So they start as symbolic, then they become objects of scientific inquiry, and then they become designed and manufactured. We can track the same story with mountains. This is Palladio doing the Temple of Fortuna at Vesta. So the building sits on something that is supposed to be a symbolic mountain. When Bernini designs the Palazzo Montecitorio in Rome, he has these crazy clouds, lintels on all of the windows, and he says clouds are very particular. This one part of the building cannot be made by stone cutters. It has to be made by sculptors, because only sculptors know how to observe clouds. So here they're becoming scientific. He has a very specific definition of what a cloud is, and only some people know how to do it. Know how to carve this mountain. And then by the time you get to the 60s, you have firms like Haus Rücker that are making mountains and moving them around and producing a kind of artificial whirls. Just one last time, just to be clear, these are not actual trees. These are symbolic trees. These are trees that are standing in the place of columns. Then trees become subjects of very close and profound scientific observation. Schinkel was kind of obsessed with trees. Viollet-le-Duc was obsessed with trees. They read botany, like trees become scientific objects, and then you get somebody like Cedric Price who makes everything into a tree, right? So on the one hand, we could say architecture has a particular relationship to nature. It's a relationship like all other things. It begins with apartness. It turns apartness into a symbolic system. Then it turns it into a scientific system. And then it turns it into a system of production, right? So this is one history. But I wonder whether we could tell a different history, like one that is a little bit less familiar, or let's say, what kind of action can I as a historian take to use all of this evidence that I just gave you to produce a different argument that might have a different kind of effect on you. So when we look back at this drawing, we could say, well, it's apart and the world has been erased. You know, nature has to get out of the way in order for buildings to get there, and it's, you know, all of those kinds of violence and so forth. But we could also say something like, it's almost a miracle that there are any trees in there at all. Like, why is he still bothering to draw trees? Like, what are the trees adding? Why do they find a way into this visual image? And in fact, if we think today about nature, let's say, the first thing that historians of nature will tell us that there is no such thing as nature. It's way too broad a concept, just like it's really not acceptable anymore these days to talk about mankind, right? Way too generic and way too specific all at the same time. So how could we get in there and start to think about things more specifically? So this afternoon, instead of thinking about architecture and nature and architecture and climate and very generally, I'm going to try to hone in a little bit and think about architecture and plants, maybe trees in particular. And one of the reasons for doing that is that botanists, not just botanists, but anthropologists, all kinds of people, have really invented fundamentally new ways of thinking about plant life. One of the intriguing aspects of which they call plant thinking, forms of plant intelligence. So one of the things that plant thinkers think about trees, plants in general and trees in particular, is that they have interests. You know, normally when we say somebody's in a vegetative state, it's like the worst. Like, right? There's nobody here who wants to be in a vegetative state. So vegetative state means no conscious, no moving, no nothing, no nothing. And plant thinkers think, well, this is a complete form of bias against plants. And plants have interests. They want to do things like survive. And they have forms of intelligence that enable them to survive, and they push back against things that would limit their survivability. So if now I'm just talking about just on the level of drawing, if we go back to our friend Richard Neutra and look at a drawing like this and start paying attention to the tree, and on multiple levels, we can see certain kinds of things. That tree is at a very weird angle with respect to the building, right? I don't quite know who's getting out of the way of the other, but that tree is pushing back, right? I'm not actually going to get out of your way quite so easily. And for those of you who have taken any landscape studies, like in an art history class, you would also recognize that in visual terms, the tree is doing something that art historians call producing repoussoir, which is the French word for pushing back. And at a certain moment, many images, perspectival images, started to have big things at the front that served to push the space of the picture plane back, to give you the sense that there was something big in the front so that deep space would appear behind it, which is to say, it's actually the tree in this image that is producing the space in which the building exists. So once you start thinking about trees as pushing back, you start finding all kinds of things where the relationship between the tree and the ground are being reversed from the Sangalo. It's not that the tree is being erased, but the tree actually makes possible the space in which architecture unfolds. Once they push back, once you start looking for them pushing back, they also move in. They make new kinds of ground, and all kinds of buildings start to be organized around the accommodation of plant life. Let's say architects are being trained by trees to help trees survive. This is a famous example. You may know the House of the Future by the Smithsons. You normally think of it as like the groovy plastic thing, but please remember it was organized around a tree right in the middle. The Forest Building, this is one of the best product showrooms. Venturi and Denise Scott Brown did one, Site did several. This one is the only one to still exist. It's the only one that survived. The site was full of trees. James Wines and his team built the building around the trees so as not to cut them down. And these trees now return the favor, enabling the building to survive when all of the others have been torn down. Another thing that plant thinkers say about plants is that they are fundamentally social. Plants and trees in particular gather in forests and work collaboratively to produce maximum forms of survival across species. It's interesting to think that even though we understand cities to be full of asphalt and like the Sangalo erasing the crust of the earth, cities are giant forests and became forested almost as soon as they became metropolises. This is what you're looking at, the oldest surviving photograph of a human being. But what's interesting is that there's only one poor soul at the front, but lots of trees, right? So the urban forest is an interesting and rich place for the sociality of trees, a place maybe where we could even think that trees are modeling social organization that urban planners then follow, all the way through, again, the Smithsons, who were kind of obsessed with trees and added trees to everything and developed crazy, interesting ways about being social. The metabolists gathered trees together to make collective communities out of trees and so forth. Another point, so trees have intelligence and intention. Trees are social. And a third element that is fundamental to plant thinking today is that trees and plants communicate with each other and with other species. They have elaborate chemical and electrical impulses that often run through root systems and so forth. They respond when attacked, their leaves change, they send off signals and so forth. Trees are talking all the time in languages that we don't understand. Sometimes they do it by making clusters. I told you Schinkel was, I think I told you Schinkel was obsessed with trees. He tended to draw some in pairs like this, like they're ganging up together. Those couples of trees are repeated. You can do a hunt for Schinkel trees. From the 80s on, every architect that you can imagine redrew Schinkel's trees. They tended to draw them together. So the drawing itself became a way not just for the tree to survive, but for have Schinkel's drawings of the trees survive and self-replicate. Tree and plant historians are super interested in the effect that the way trees get processed by photography affects their survivability. So I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but you're looking at what you're trying to see in this very dark image is an effect on the landscape of all of the rhododendron at the bottom of the image. This is a Scottish. This is in Scotland. The rhododendron were brought in by Scottish estate owners in the 18th century because Scotland was getting swept up in the picturesque phase, and they wanted rhododendron because they were rough and tumble and super picturesque, which is to say they produce good image according to the aesthetic standards of the day. Like many places, by the early 19th century, the Scottish landlords were running out of money. They didn't have enough money to cut all of their groomed, picturesque landscape, so the rhododendron became overgrown. As they became overgrown, they were no longer picturesque, but they came to be described as invasive species that ruined the look of the landscape. So this invasive alien species, I mean, you know, the vocabulary, this is a vocabulary they use is kind of horrible, now it's all being torn out. So these plants that the Scots invited in are now being ripped out of the ground because they no longer meet contemporary standards of imageability. So the plant historians are standing there taking these kinds of images and say, well, you know, the problem with them is that they produce, you know, you can either get the picture in too much light or you can get the right kind of lighting, but then you can't see the plants. So they're essentially arguing that standards on the iPhone and the various filters that they have lead to certain kinds of expectations about what plants in the world should look like, and those expectations determine whether they get torn down or not, and therefore affect their survival rates. Okay, so plants are communicating, they're communicating with each other, with us, with the way they make images, and so forth. So if plant thinkers are saying, well, we can't think about nature, we have to get much more specific, we have to think about plants, we have to think about trees, we have to just get more down to concrete details, I thought, okay, well, let me think about one building then. How do I think plant architecture in architectural terms? So I like to start dumb. I just like go for the dumb example. So I thought, okay, I'm going to look at a plant. And this is a plant. This is the Tillman water reclamation plant built in the 1970s in LA. So the plant is an interesting thing. It's a plant, not a factory. I had to look up what's the difference between a plant and a factory. I didn't know, right? So plants are places where local resources are extracted from the earth and turned into products. That's what a plant is. So it's very different from a factory. The original use of the word factory was a place where things were exchanged in far away lands, not places of production, but places of mobilization. So plants were kind of stuck to the ground like a plant, and factories could move all over the place. They could be apart. And therefore, it's no wonder that there is an enormous cult of factory buildings in architecture, but very little attention to the nature of plants. I will also remind you, or tell you if you don't know, that in the Italian Latinate languages, plan and plant are the same word. Long before a plan was understood as a horizontal section, right? Technically, that's what a plan is now. It's a horizontal cut through a building near the ground. A plan was something that was literally drawn on the surface of the earth, like the Sangallo plan. Right? Vitruvius describes drawing on the surface of the earth. So when Neutra said, I planted this building here, he was actually activating an architectural tradition that imagined buildings as having a place near the surface of the earth. So one of the reasons that this building is unknown is because it's a plant. It's very local. People think of the architect as local. It kind of got repressed. It just does these things nearby. There's a logic that kept it from being mobile, if you will. Now, the history of this building is something like this, just very quickly. In 1972, this little law was passed by Richard Nixon called the Environmental Protection Act. We now have a president who's doing absolutely everything he can to undo the effects of the Environmental Protection Act, but nevertheless, it was made the law of the land in 1972. And what happened was, if you did not adhere to environmental standards, you did not get federal money. So Los Angeles was caught in environment, even though now we think of California as the foreground of all environmental things, in the 1970s, it was way behind. And I mean, it's funny, like, so environmental problems in the 1970s were a huge topic of discussion. You've probably seen Chinatown. It's all about the water wars, right? You may know about Rayner Banham here, fantastically standing not in front of a forest, but in front of a fresco of trees on a middle school. You know, he never actually went anywhere, quote, natural. He just liked the images more. You know, so he wrote the book on LA and celebrating, I love the car, I love the car, I love driving in the car, I always want to be in the car, I love the car. And the response to his book was, do you not understand that the car is polluting everything absolutely everywhere? How can you celebrate the car without thinking about it in an environmental context? So all I'm saying is I'm not like chastising Rayner Banham very much. I just a little bit, because it's kind of like it's a little bit low-hanging fruit now. But just to say that by the 1970s, this was a known problem. Like the issues of the environment were knowable. There was like maybe not so much in the 40s, maybe not so much in the 50s. By the 70s, it was in your face, right? So the problem with LA, it was not yet a climate problem. What LA was doing was dumping sewage water into the ocean. Development kept going, more and more sewage directly into the ocean. So what LA had to do was reduce the amount of sewage it put in the ocean. Just, you gotta keep this in mind. It needed to do this in order to get more federal money for more development that would produce more sewage. Okay, so you see there's a kind of cycle. It's very hard to point fingers at good and bad. So Donald Tillman, an ex-Army guy, an engineer, and the city engineer of LA, decided that he would produce a water reclamation plant, a place to clean the sewage water, clean enough that it could go into the ocean, or more importantly, that it could be recycled for agricultural purposes so that they could get more money from the federal government to build more suburbia. So what you're looking at here is the plan of this whole complex. And what Tillman understood was that he needed not just to clean the water, but he needed to convince people that semi-clean water was clean enough to re-enter the human food chain. Like, it's very tricky, right? Here's water, it's used, like used water. Like I don't know, like everybody now does bottled water. Everybody wants clean water. They want to pollute the world with plastic bottles in order to have clean water. So there was a huge psychological problem to kind of semi-clean water. And then let's also keep in mind that a sewage treatment plant is enormously stinky. I mean, beyond stinky. Stinky, stinky, crazy stinky. So he's putting these multiple football fields of exposed human stench in the middle of a residential district while saying, here, drink the water that comes from this place. I mean, it was a kind of crazy problem, a totally crazy problem. So his idea was he had been a student at UCLA, and he had taken extension courses with a Japanese garden guy. I'll tell you about him in just a moment briefly. But he thought, I'm going to have the Japanese garden with aromatic plants that will clean the stench, or theoretically clean the stench that is produced by the cleaning of the water. So all of these local processes of cleaning the air and cleaning the water are all happening here at the plant. And in order to convince people that this is working, I need to hire an architect. I need to hire an architect that will bring people out here to witness this transformation of dirt into development, of stench into perfume, and help me remediate the effects of pollution on the environment. Okay, so this is that building. And it was designed by Anthony Lumsden, who was one of the head architects of Dim Jim. This is another reason that very few people know this building, because most people love to hate corporate architects, and Dim Jim is AECOM, like the biggest corporate whatever, so like no corporation can do any good really, and so this also has to be forgotten. So I'll just, Lumsden had worked for Kevin Roche. At the beginnings of, he was the project architect for the Oakland Museum, which is often described as one of the early, quote, environmental planning projects, buildings designed around environmental themes, because it's considered to be non-directional. It's a series of squares and lots of plants. So he was already kind of in the juju, if you will, from his days at Kevin Roche's. So the way the building works, so this is got some science labs and so forth, but what it really is a visitor center. It's a place for people to come and be inculcated into this process of environmental remediation. You enter the building here. It's kind of weird. It doesn't really, what is this? A little bit space agey. It's got these long tubes. You enter in. The tube on the left-hand side cascades down over a lake. So this is an artificial lake made out of cleaned water. You move through the back. When you get to the back, you go up on this long platform that you see on the left of the image. It takes you up. It sneaks you out. You see the blue in the back. It takes you out towards this giant series of football fields where these shallow basins full of plant life are busy there eating the waste out of the water. So it's really a giant botanical garden, if you will, of protozoa delivered around through basin to a basin. So they change color. They're quite spectacular depending on the temperature, depending on what's in the water that day, depending on where you are. So it's like a giant color field painting. It's like a giant Rothko with a series of colors all laid out perfectly flat. So you go from this biotechnical garden, by the time you finish that loop, you go into this biotechnical garden, which is the Japanese garden by this Kawana. He had been born in Japan and became very famous for designing Japanese gardens in the United States using local plants. Everything is local, right? No Japanese plants here. This is a local plants. The use of local plants in Japanese gardens was a very elaborate part of the reconciliation with Japan after the war. So you showed Japan, the idea was that you would show Japan as nature-loving, as passive, as non-military, as non-aggressive, and above all, as amenable to being assimilated into American culture. Because you could take Japanese architecture and make it American by using plants. And of course, this is all about water. And it was supposed to be smelly, like, rosemary plants and so forth to try to get rid of the smell. It's really such a sweet idea, but like totally doesn't work. So very feel good, everything felt good about this. The engineers of the city thought it was a little too fancy. Why are we putting all this money in this fancy architecture? But the architectural community totally loved it. Like, it's amazing. It's infrastructure in the service of landscape and art plants and so on and so forth. And everybody really loved it. You have seen this building many times. If you've ever watched any kind of science fiction or television or whatever, it's the site of various things, and probably the best known is an early Star Trek, The Next Generation, where it's Rubicon 3. If there are any Trekkies here, this is Rubicon 3. That is an oxygen-based planet with carbon-based humanoids that live there. They're always joyful. They love having sex 24/7, and they don't really do anything else. And by the way, it's called Edo, which is, of course, Tokyo, right? So So there's like a whole, everybody's drinking the Kool-Aid about all of this, like this is the perfect new nature world, the plant, it's local, it smells good, it cleans the thing. You know, I mean, it's all good, right? But, you know, there's also a little bit more going on here. Lumsden himself, the building fits into a very small series of buildings that do not look very dim-jimmy in particular. He had a theory of architectural fit. This was the word that he used, that he said was dependent on what he called the mutation effect. So he's clearly thinking about plant biology in some way, because mutation is something that happens in the animal kingdom, right? And what he meant by the mutation effect was that architecture should be released from the mechanical systems of production and reproduction that had dictated the large-scale planning efforts of modernism, which is to say, like the Ford Foundation, repeated elements, everything the same, bilateral symmetry, forms of efficiency, replication, you know, like the Seagram building and all things that look like that. He argued buildings should fit because environmental, I'm quoting him, environmental conditions had become much more complicated than those that had given birth to the Tower of Louis Sullivan, that had a front and a back and a side, and they were all the same. So he worked with the firm to develop this stress skin technology, right? So Dim Jim is famous for these curtain wall buildings in which the curtain is separated from the structure of the building. It doesn't have any load-bearing weight. It's basically just a weather envelope. It's just an environmental screen. And he argued that this enabled buildings to be free of repetition, to respond to the environment, and to mutate according to environmental conditions. So they could fit on a weird site, they could have spandrel heights of different dimensions on one side of the building if it got one kind of light, and a different kind of dimension on the other side. Okay, so the Dim Jim buildings start to mutate in an almost plant-like behavior. And then he said the plant mutation effect intersects under certain circumstances with what he then called the extrusion effect. So this is a project for the Beverly Hills Hotel where you see a kind of regular building with these funny tubes in the front. The tubes are made out of this stress skin, so they're rational in their construction, but if you look in section, they graft together to enable different kinds of spaces to emerge on the inside. The building is not the same in the front as it's got no front in the back. But his idea about extrusion was that the building could just grow and be added on to if conditions changed, but it would also just grow until there weren't enough resources for it anymore, like a plant, right? So like a plant, it runs different programs depending on winter, summer, how much light there is, how much water it is, and because of this extrusion effect capacity, the building is able to sit in its environment, to fit in its environment in a particular way. So today, some of you will think that on some jury or other, you got critiqued by somebody like John for merely extruding your plan into a building. Like extrusion has become a terrible word because extrusion is automatic, unthinking, vegetative, right? But if you think about extrusion and plants as a different kinds of intelligence, one that is always adapting and perfectly fitting, maybe you begin to think about your own techniques in a different way. So there's a very small number of these projects that are mutation effect combined with extrusion effect, including, this is another one of the best products, that come together to produce what we might call plant architecture. This is the section. You see the various components that I have been describing. So all of those things came together in the 1970s. Lumsden is thinking some things, you know, he's clearly using a kind of intuition about plant behavior. He's using that vocabulary. His words are environment, mutation, extrusion, and skins. These are all biological forms. But he's also doing this in order to facilitate additional development, right? It's very hard to understand, or do we care what his intentions were? What's more important, you know, is it what we can make of it now? So if everybody loved that building at the very beginning, if its intentions were thought to be good, it very quickly became kind of evil. So if you just are interested in media, go to the IMDb database and plug in this building and see the things that were filmed there. It all starts with, you know, sex-loving Edo people in Star Trek, but very slowly it becomes the site first of like the Russian mob, and then like the Italian mob and ninjas or until it finally just becomes a kind of generic bad American corporation. I love this. This is from the car computer in the Knight Rider, where what's the name of the car? It's got a name, right? Thank you, is telling what's-his-face, like where to go by producing a computer rendering of this thing so that he can go kill the bad corporate head. So, you know, what was bad and good in the 70s became bad in the 80s, became bad, forgotten in the 90s, and maybe now we can begin to think about it in a new sort of way. So plant architecture is really a plant. We can think about locale and various things, and I just thought I would end by returning to a different part of LA and returning to Neutra, where I began. Neutra was somebody who really thought about the environment a lot. He drew a lot of trees. There are lots of things to study about the way he represented trees. But I would also tell you about a story written in the 1990s by a fiction writer named Leslie Dick. So she's an American fiction writer. She spent a couple of years in LA, and she lived in a Neutra house. And while she was living in the Neutra house, she got some kind of sore on one of her butt cheeks, if you'll pardon the expression. And this sore became worse and worse and worse and worse, like it got really bad. Like the skin became, you know, necrotic, and it was bad, and she kept going to the doctor. And then finally, it turned out that she had been bitten by a spider. And she took this rage out of having been, how could she have been bitten by a spider? She took it out on Neutra by writing this terrible story, and essentially saying, she writes a lot about poisonous dwellers of the desert, and LA is a desert, and it's full of poisonous things, and what an architect should do at a minimum is protect me from getting bitten by poisonous dwellers of the desert. So architecture was bad because its cage was not protective enough. And I suppose I wonder whether today we might want to think in another way, which is that the Neutra houses are extremely porous, and all kinds of critters come in and out. It's not a human environment all by itself. Maybe the Neutra houses are really good places for scorpions. And I'm not sure whether the scorpion has more of a right to be there than I do, which is one of the reasons I'm so interested in this Ben Thorpe Brown project and its imagining of what the future after us might look like, what its architecture might look like, and whether or not we think that is a good thing or a bad thing, and what kind of actions as architects you might want to take in relation to that is the thought that I will leave you with this evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. We have a few minutes for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic.
Thank you so much for your talk, and especially the inclusion of the Edo planet just kind of got to me. I saw that episode recently.
There's always a
Speaking
Trekkie
of
somewhere.
scorpions and architecture, you're due for a visit to Taliesin West. I wanted to ask you about the Biosphere 2, as it might be included in your thoughts about how that would, and maybe the failure of architecture to contain a sort of way of thinking, a vegetative state that couldn't be contained, or a cultural project of containing that. Its failures and its impossible future.
I thought you were going to ask me about Biodome, which was also filmed here, by the way. It seems that mass media has a better memory for architecture's response to the environment than architecture does. I think I understand the question. I think it's an excellent question, and I think that's probably a question better posed really to botanists. I mean, they're doing a lot of work, and the seed banks and all of that kind of stuff. And it's really, I don't know. I mean, I really just don't know. What I do think is that apartness has increasingly done more harm than good. That's for sure. I think we all understand that. And my expertise is not in the botanical aspect, but in the way architecture has facilitated the idea of apartness, both of itself and other things. So I guess I would say I would defer, but architecture can start to think about not apartness. I mean, I don't know what that would look like. Let me just be honest. I don't think it means a sod roof. I mean, it could also mean a sod roof. I got nothing against sod roofs, but I'm not thinking sod roofs. I'm not thinking decorating our walls with herbs. Great, decorate your walls with herbs. But like herbs are used for cooking for humans, and I just that's not the point. So I'm going to answer. This is not your question, but I'm going to answer a hypothetical question if somebody asks me, which is, I like to answer my own question or ask my own questions because I know the answers to those. When environmental issues and like LEED certification issues first started to become a bit of a nagging problem in architecture, there was a huge amount of resistance to it. And the form the resistance took was that is not an architectural problem. And the evidence people gave was, I remember President Scott Cohen saying very clearly, who I love dearly and whose work I adore, so again, I'm not pointing any fingers, I'm just speaking historically. Scott said, well, if a Bob Stern building can get a gold-rated LEED certification or whatever the top is, and I think a building by Bob Stern was the first one by an architect that anybody would have heard of to have gotten this LEED certification, and it looked like Monticello or something like that. Scott's response, well, so this is clearly not an architectural problem. And so that was kind of the Kool-Aid that I grew up drinking, which is that there are people who work on LEED certification, on HVAC, on moving things, et cetera, but that's not a cultural project, that's a technical project. And then, more recently, there's what kind of materials you're going to use. Okay, so maybe let's not be wasteful for materials and so forth. But that's not a disciplinary project. That's a building construction project. All right, so I kept hearing all of these ways to not let these issues become part of what architects generally think of as their domain, their problem, and therefore their responsibility. So it would be great if we thought about material, all of those things too, but there are a lot of people doing that work and tracking how many trees you cut down to make this and that and so forth. That's not my expertise. My expertise is in the cultural project, and the cultural project that makes it possible to do things like kill a scorpion, or think of a plant as lesser, because it's that thought that produces the possibility of all kinds of things that I don't believe in, including, climate change. So that's not exactly your question, but it's a way of saying, like, I don't have the technical expertise to think about how to make plants survive in biodome. I would rather think about the cultural problem of only valuing the forms of intelligence that look like the one that you have. And maybe there are others.
Other questions? I have a question that isn't about flat ontology, because the framing of the project in terms of tuning into a post-human or non-human desire is clear. How might the project be reframed in terms of ideology? Because I'm thinking of, going all the way back to Adolf Loos. For him, ornament was ideology that needed to be stripped away. For Tafuri, for Mary McLeod and Aggregate, it's design that's ideological and needs to be stripped away. Mark Wigley, in his Architecture of Atmosphere, argued that architects try to strip ideology away, and in that attempt, all we do is make more atmosphere. How does atmospheric perspective and trees, in fact, in this project, relate to ideology? Is it a pro-ideology project? Is it a post-ideology project? How do you understand it in those terms?
I actually don't know when ideology as a term became intrinsically always bad. Which is to say, like, for me, if your ideology is progressive and left-leaning, go be ideological. I'm happy. Right? So if ideology is the constellation of ideas that try to persuade people to behave in a certain kind of way, the problem is not that, for me. The problem is, to what purpose is that ideology put? And do you recognize it as fabricated and therefore not eternal, subject to revision, right? So I've been, one of the reasons I find it, in thinking about this, very important to take one architect and say, well, in the 30s it was this, in the 50s it was this, in the 60s it was this, is just to say that conditions actually are not always the same. And if you become rigid in your ideological position, you're going to miss the boat. Right, so we were talking earlier this morning about the defensive posture of architects in the 90s. They were defending themselves precisely against people like Mary McLeod and Manfredo Tafuri, who thought that all design was in the service of capitalist development. It was not the problem of ideology, it was what ideology, a kind of unfettered capitalism. And they really wanted to resist that out of a different ideological position. So I don't think the problem is ideology as such. It's whether you recognize yourself to be working under ideological circumstances, which is to say neither truth nor falsehood exactly, but belief systems that are responsive to conditions and to what purpose you would like them to be put. So, I think people now, a new word, it's not new, but I started with the word action. I think a way that I would not have thought about work 15 years ago, I do think now, which is, what action does it provoke? So is it ideological that I try to provoke action? Yes. Do I know what that action is going to be? Can I control it? No, I don't.
So thank you for your great lecture. I'm going to actually follow up on John's question. We passed a critical theory discourse in our, in architecture, post-structuralism, all of that, but we're noticing a post-humanism discussions, the eco-criticisms, and as you showed, and discussed, it's really interesting because in our discipline, either we looked at nature as picturesque in the background, or we mimicked nature, and this is the only way that we translated nature into aesthetic of our work. And in a way, like, you know, we had this alienation towards, you know, aesthetic and nature. It seemed that these are in front of each other, you know, the discussion, I mean, the tradition of aesthetic theory from Kant, Hegel, Adorno, all of them, right? But having new philosophers like Gernot Bohm who talk about sort of new ways of thinking about aesthetic and new ways of thinking about atmosphere that John asked, right? So I think my question is this: how do you see, with all these problems of the world, climate change and all these discussions, how can we interpret the new definition to aesthetic, right? Do you think that atmosphere is the word for it, that can bring culture and nature together? How we can interpret aesthetic? That's pretty much my question.
Well, I didn't use the word once. So probably on a fundamental level, that's my answer. Lumsden said about, when he was describing the extrusion effect and mutation, he said mutation was the result of intuition. It couldn't be calculated, it just kind of happened. It was that like this, and extrusion was sort of automatic. And he said, it's like a tree. A tree doesn't plan itself in order to be beautiful. Beautiful is a human concept, and the tree does not think of itself as obligated to human interests. So it's a very interesting idea. It doesn't mean that you can't find the tree beautiful, or that it has an aesthetic quality, or that you would, as the plant thinkers say, the way plants or whatever meet aesthetic determinations isn't real. It has a real effect, right? So if a plant looks ugly, you know, if a plant looks ugly, people think less about tearing it down. If it looks beautiful, you know, but I don't know what is an ugly plant? Like, I mean, I don't even know, I don't quite know how to think about that, right? But the continuity with post-structuralism would be something like this, right? So it used to be, there was dirt was bad, clean was good. That's the modern thing. Then under post-structuralism, dirt was redefined. Dirt started to be like a semiotic problem. Dirt, if it was in a garden, was good. If it was in a house, it was bad. And therefore, dirt was reconceptualized as anything that is in the wrong place, right? So this is a way of de-essentializing things, and I think it's that same, like on a philosophical level, on a conceptual level, on a theoretical level, it's that resistance to essentializing things that I think is operating amongst the people thinking today that interest me. And I don't think that it doesn't have cultural and visual consequences, but I think the word aesthetic is too predetermined by certain kinds of ideals, and I don't think it's bad, I just don't think it's useful. The minute you're thinking in those terms, you're already determining your actions, right? Because you're gonna start looking for the thing that you would already consider to be aesthetic. And how do you go in a different direction if you're always led by the nose in a direction that is like, goes back to Plato? That's a long thread. You know, it's got a lot of force behind it. That's hard to break that noose. It's really hard. So, I mean, that may not be a satisfying answer. You may want, like a script, this is the aesthetic, and this is how to produce it, but I would just say that that's much more reductive and mechanical than Lumsden's extrusion effect, which had a logic of indeterminacy behind it, which I think is interesting to think, kind of to think about. So.
I'm really interested in this idea of action and how it translates into something like ideology, which is brought up in John's question, and particularly how you think it relates to Manifesto as like a tool that architects have used throughout history to talk about these kind of cultural shifts. Because during your lecture, I keep on thinking of like Joseph Paxton and Schubart and the glass Manifesto, and sort of these parallels of looking at ruins, looking at the sublime, and this kind of takeover of nature over architecture, and then translate that into something like glass and steel are amazing. We should all build in glass and steel. So I'm just curious if you see that kind of parallel to today's contemporary movements, and if Manifesto is something we need to repeat as a tool, or there's other forms.
But do you mean quite literally the literary form of the Manifesto? Is that what you mean, or? Because I think of a manifesto technically as a form of writing,
Yeah.
right? That's short, that's polemical, that, there are certain it's like a rhetorical apparatus. Is that what you mean, or because I don't know how to get from manifesto to the Crystal Palace. So I think you're using the word differently than I understand it. So could you just reformulate so I answer your question? Like demonstration, or?
Well, what is the result of this kind of study of plants, or study of clouds or mountains? What is the kind of tangible tool that can generate out of? Because in my mind, Manifesto was that kind of result from that inquiry into the sublime, into the ruins, and that became kind of the tool of that moment to talk about these shifts in where architecture is going. So it's not so much what is the Manifesto today and should we use Manifesto, but like, do you see this resulting in a particular form or particular tool?
Yeah, I am pretty annoyingly non-prescriptive about these things. I know it's really annoying. But I guess I would say, just to turn it in a different way. So I think I probably knew an awful lot about the Crystal Palace, which is to say I'd heard it presented, I knew about this, I knew about glass, I knew a lot of those things before it was emphasized to me that there were trees living in it. Right, which is to say, it was not just built that way by Paxton because greenhouses were cheap and fast, which is what I had learned was the point, and that I had learned that as an ideological demonstration of modernism, because it did everything to be cheap and fast, including getting rid of the architect and celebrating this techno marvel. But in fact, it was, at least in part, done by a landscape architect, a botanical garden guy, because there were plants on the site, big giant trees that nobody was going to tear down. So I just have to say that it kind of messed up my sense of what modernism, cheap and fast and erasing and whoa, that was okay, that's not exactly the Crystal Palace as I learned it to be. And then if you start looking a little bit more at the Crystal Palace, it was full of plants. And Owen Jones was, he kind of made a fortune at the Crystal Palace, not because he was doing the Alhambra and all of those kind of global politics things that we know that he was doing, but because he was using chromolithography techniques that he had developed for printmaking and so forth to make certain kinds of tiles, which he used to make plant boxes. So if you look through photographs of the Crystal Palace, there are all kinds of potted plants everywhere that are growing in printed, it's totally wild. So the idea that there is only a commodity culture, only models of capitalist efficiency there, it's not exactly true. And there are certain kinds of accommodations. Now, if we wrote those into our view, because this is my action, I don't have to build the next Crystal Palace, but I might write the next book about it, right? So what do? Is I start calling attention to those things that are part of our field, that are part of our intelligence, and just saying, what does that do? You know, I get these weird little obsessions. So the camel things. I mean, those are kind of funny. But I have some other ones. So so in the 50s, the period that Neutra was arguing, we've got development, it's becoming hostile. There are too many houses. They're all the same, like the post-Levitt town doodly-doo. So if you start looking at the architecture by those people, like Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones is a mid-century architect, did a lot of, spec houses. And by the 1950s, every Quincy Jones house had to have a kind of courtyard with a tree, because that's just the ideology, that the house, like you have the front yard, you have a mailbox, and you have a tree. Like, it's not a chicken in every pot, it's a tree in every suburban yard. But if you're building for a spec developer, the one thing you don't know is where that house is going to land. And therefore, the second thing you don't know is what goddamn kind of tree you can plant this house around. So you start looking at Quincy Jones' drawings, and you look at those trees, and they are totally fascinating, as Quincy Jones is trying to produce an ideological impossibility, which is this house is about this place planted in this ground, and I symbolize with a tree, but the tree has to be generic because it could be anywhere, it could be any tree. So you get this impossible tree. You get the design of that form of development turns out to be the design of a species, and that is incredibly interesting. Right? Architects are designing trees all the time, and they're not stable, and they're, and one of the oldest forms of design is the design of plants. People do it, animals do it, plants do it. It's an incredibly rich and interesting problem. So next time you guys do a studio project, so I'm doing a little show on trees by architects, and wrote to some of my friends, you got any trees for me? And I expected an answer that I hoped that I wouldn't get. But I got it a lot. And that answer was, you know what, I really try to avoid drawing trees in my drawings. And I thought, okay. I find the idea that you have to avoid drawing trees in your drawing because you can't master them. That's really what that means. You can't master them, so you just don't have them at all. I think that gives architect their own form of responsibility to the state that we find ourselves in. So what would it mean to just say to your architecture students when you're doing your first semester house project, a lot of students do houses at some point, it's just little, and we say that the tree, at least in American domestic architecture, is really important around the issue of the house. Like, what tree? Whose tree? You can design a tree, you're going to plant a tree, where does the tree go? Does it live in the house? Does it live next to the house? Like, just what do you do with the tree? Like, I don't know what would happen, but I think that action pedagogically could be really interesting. And I would say, do you guys have a landscape architecture program here? Don't cheat. Like, the landscape people have their own thing. They have their own, they're not better than you guys, by the way, because they deal with I don't know how many landscape people are here, but I'm assuming you guys are architecture students because usually they don't talk to each other, but in schools. But I'm just making my assumptions here. But all I'm saying is, like, you talk to a landscape architect, they don't talk about like oak trees. They talk about plant materials, right? So they have their own vocab for doing exactly the same thing. But what I'm saying is you can't just palm it off on them, right? Because the plan is a plant. So how does your building meet the ground? What kinds of plants does it have? Blah, blah, blah. I mean, I just think it's a different way of thinking about it. So even just like, where are you going to draw the section cut for your plan? My guess is that Studio 101, although already in high school, begins with the drawing of a plan. It almost, you know, we like to say modernism is over. Modernism invented the goddamn plan, and you guys repeat it all the time. You start with the plan, you start with the plan, you start with the plan. You don't start with the ground, not really. Because the minute you're talking about a plan, you're now imagining that thing a little bit off the ground. So even though only Le Corbusier, they float, the Sherbard up, you know, or the bicycle guys, everything's floating, utopia is floating off the ground. Every building that is drawn with that kind of plan, that is drawn with a plan that is off the ground, is floating, imagines itself as other, imagines itself as not sitting on the ground, as not being part of, you know, like that. I don't know where it goes, but I think my intuition, if I borrow Lumsden's word, is that my intuition is that it will go someplace interesting. And I don't find sod on the roof, could be good. Again, I got nothing against actual plants, right? I'm not saying that plants are bad, but I am saying that landscape people can deal with plant material, and botanists can deal with biodome and all that kind of stuff, but you guys can deal with other things. And I don't know what else to say, except I encourage you to think about it. And I'll come back and see your first year studio next year and see how you draw plants and trees. I'll be curious.
Hi, Yuting. So I'm very interested in the topic about because the culture I'm come from is really respect to either the plants, the trees, and all the life surrounding the tree. People like it getting around, but it's kind of like it's kind of touring into losing that aspect right now. But however, when it's getting bad, people start to just designing the not landscape, designing like nature, but which is like, for example, like the big park, natural park, the central park, something like that. But those are designing nature. But however, how is that possible? Like, is there any way we can also respecting the intelligence of the plant, intelligence of the tree, and however cooperate using the tree and the gesture and the symbolic to creating the space as an architect?
So just maybe as a way of a little bit wrapping up, I guess I would say I really hope that people want to design nature, because if we don't design it now, it's just going to go away. Like now the design of nature, like that's got to happen. We got to design our way out of this, for sure. So just letting it go, it's too late for that. Like what science has proven is that if we just let it go and be respectful, that's it. So finding a way to collaborate, like collaboration is a very interesting problem. And I don't think people like Olmsted and all those guys, they only designed nature using plant material. They didn't collaborate with it because there was no sentience, there was nothing to collaborate with, there was only stuff to master. So just how to think about, and sorry to be so polemical, but like it used to be that like men couldn't imagine collaborating with women because they weren't smart enough. They had lower intelligence. They were like that, right? So now it would be kind of hard to say that you can't collaborate with women, I hope, right? But so, I mean, this just takes some kind of shifting, and I don't know how long it will take or what the effects will be or whatever, but I would say collaborating, and I'll give you an example of a recent pedagogical situation that I observed, which was as a thesis student at a supposedly very prestigious institution that I have nothing to do with, and started off his thesis project, and he just said, I want to do my thesis around plants. I think that architects don't do anything with plants, and they should do something with plants, and everybody on the thesis committee like roll their eyes. It's like, oh my God, like plants is not an architectural idea. like plants are decoration or plants are this. It is not an architectural idea. The poor guy, he's going to end up with a green wall and a sodded roof, and it's going to be awful. It was awful. I mean, the rolling of the eyes, I've just never seen a student like responded to in that way. The end of the story is that kid got the thesis prize. And I don't know whether part of the reason he got it was because he just ignored what everybody said. And there was a lot of respect for somebody who just decided to go their own way. But what he ended up doing, this is whatever, but what he ended up doing is he built these walls. And by the way, he actually built them. So these were not just drawings. He had drawings and models, but he built them like in an old 60s kind of, applied science sort of way. And he shaped the walls in such that there was enough depth at various angles that plant roots could grow this way instead of just down, and that they would grow together and meet the other roots coming from the other side and lock into a structural system. So the plants' life, the way they grew, the way they sought water, the way they sought air, et cetera, turned into a new kind of wall section and a structuring of this wall. And this, the jury thought, was a fundamentally original idea. Somebody here maybe knows somebody else who did it, like, but it was the coming at the double side, the use of the tension of the roots against each other, the knowledge that roots have certain electrical impulses, that they can go around each other without killing each other. Plants are very smart, right? They figure out how to do all of that stuff. This kid figured out how to turn that into an architectural structure. And so he took something that everybody not only didn't think had much salience, but ridiculed, and ended up doing something really quite profound and interesting. So I couldn't have anticipated it. Was I one of the people who roll my eyes? Oh God, I was really worried about him. I was really worried about how that thesis project was going to come out. And I was not his thesis advisor, so I get no credit. This was just emerged at the end of the thing. I'm a bit of a sap, but I have to say I was practically in tears just watching this kid, this alone kid, nobody, and I don't know, it was kind of amazing. So that's the prediction. So the prediction is not a prediction, it happened already. So I guess it's not really a prediction since it happened. But it's an example.
Okay, join us for a reception outside, and thank you very much, Sylvia, for